We live in tumultuous times. The question that I want to start the sermon and this text with to kind of frame your mindset as we kind of dive into the 12 verses that we just read here is, how can you retain your hope when the times are tumultuous? How do you maintain and retain your hope when times are tumultuous? And times are tumultuous. They always have been, it seems like. And we can extrapolate that from the text itself. 2,000 years ago, the gospel writer wants us to see that those were the times in the middle of Jerusalem and Judea and abroad in that moment. We know because of the way that he starts this paragraph. He says in verse 1, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king." This was a common way of starting historical treatises by introducing to you the world power at that time, Herod the king. Now for us, we might need that to be a little unpacked. But for most listeners in that day, they would have understood very clearly what the gospel writer was writing to and the days in which Jesus was born into. This is the kind of world Jesus was born into. Here's a little bit of background about our good friend Herod. Rome was the world power in charge at that time. They ruled everything. The empire didn't set on any city in the known world. But because the empire was so huge, the emperor often needed governors, prefects, and puppet kings to maintain stability in places that were far from Rome. And especially places that were not just far, but often experienced turbulent waters, like Jerusalem. And so he installed what we might call a puppet king. Someone who was just there to do Caesar's bidding, who was there to keep the peace and to keep stability and to keep everybody happy. And he installed a man by the name of Herod in charge of the Judean people. Herod was perhaps the perfect person initially to put in charge of a tumultuous city like Jerusalem. Herod was a mixture of a lot of things. He was ethnically Arab. He was religiously Jewish. He was culturally Greek. And he was politically Roman. Herod was very complex, and he had his fingers in a lot of different pies. He could appeal to a lot of different people and to a lot of different tribes and to a lot of different groups. And initially, he started to do just that. He was a complex individual. For example, on one hand, he was very smart, very ambitious, very resourceful. He was on the cutting edge of technology, and he brought the technological advancements of Rome to the hillsides of the Judean wilderness. For example, he created water supplies and aqueducts based on the latest and greatest in technology in that day, bringing water to places in the desert. Not only that, but he would create huge reservoirs to maintain that water. He built fortresses like Antonia and Masada, and he created new cities out of the desert, places like Caesarea Maritima, right on the beach. He created all of this stuff, and he used it to create an incredible city in his midst. So on one hand, he was smart, he was ambitious, he was resourceful. History says that he was very tall and handsome too. But on the other side, he was insecure. And out of that insecurity came a little bit of an impulsiveness. And when I say a little bit, I mean murderous impulsiveness. His insecurity was often around his authority and his power and his throne. For example, he had one of his 10 wives killed because he suspected her of infidelity. Not just his wife, but he murdered 2 of his sons because he considered them a threat to his throne. In fact, his good friend, Caesar Augustus, was once heard as quoting, saying, "I'd rather be Herod's pig than his son." For this reason, because even though he was incredibly powerful, gifted, technologically advanced, and resourceful, he often used his gifts and his wealth to assimilate and consolidate power for himself. He lived the high life while his people were suffering. And because of his impulsive, insecure nature, most Jews hated him. In fact, towards the end of his life, When he grew deathly ill, he knew that nobody would mourn his death. So as he was laying on his deathbed, he ordered the arrest of thousands of notable, wealthy people in the city and ordered them to be sequestered in a stadium in Jerusalem to be executed at the moment of his death so that there would be mourning in the city of Jerusalem when he passed. Thank God that never happened. They escaped. But if you get a little bit of a picture of Herod's brutality and his impulsive nature and his ego and his insecurity, you'll understand enough to know what the gospel writer is saying when he opens up this story preceding the Christmas birth of Jesus as these were the times of Herod. What's he saying? He's saying, we all lived in tumultuous times. You just never knew what was going to happen with this Herod character. You never knew what was going to happen, and you never knew when life was going to spiral out of control. These were tumultuous times. And for that reason, we can perhaps find a little bit of our heart resonating with that. For when have times not been tumultuous in our lives? They're tumultuous now. They were tumultuous when I was a kid. They were tumultuous when I was born into a kiddom childhood. You just never know when things are going to spiral out of control. We also live in tumultuous times, and take your pick. Whether it's on a broad level like wars or fire creeping down the hillside to your house, or divisions or corruption in high places, or just bring it down a notch into a personal level with sickness, loneliness, depression, unemployment, the cost of living, burnout, fatigue, and the list goes on. We live in difficult, trying, and certainly tumultuous times. And then when you add to that the spiritual climate of the West in which we live, which is often a desert. As people are longing, as they're wired to, for something deep. But in their wiring, in their longing, they're turning away from God and turning towards all the counterfeit gods Santa Barbara and abroad offers them, from pleasure to personal freedom and rights to civic religion and anything that they can just shove into the deep spaces and the caverns that their soul is pockmarked with. Now, you might be looking at all of this, the Christian or follower of Christ that you are, or the spiritually curious person that you are, and you might see all of this already, you might know this already, and be growing worried, like we live in tumultuous times, what do we do? What I want you to see is not verse 1 merely, but verse 2. Because verse 2 tells us what historians have often pointed out, that it's often tumultuous times are preceding an awakening of God's Spirit. God's Spirit seems to there often seems to be an awakening from God on the tail end of some of the most tumultuous times in history. And it's no different here, for right after we're introduced to one of the most brutal governors or kings of Jerusalem, we get verse 2. And behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he? Where is he who's been born the King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the brutal, antagonizing, tumultuous, upsetting days of King Herod, the wise men from the east came to Jerusalem in that moment and said, where is he? We've heard rumors that there's a new king in town, and we have come. We've dropped everything to worship him. I want you for a moment to put yourself in the shoes of your average Jewish peasant living in the big city. I want you to put yourself in their shoes. You have been living in darkened, tumultuous times. Not just Herod, but Rome. Rome is a brutal juggernaut of a dictatorship that has been oppressing people for a long time. And when people rise up and protest against them, they brutally stamp them out and make a showing of them. Not only Rome, but right there in proximity to them is the puppet King Herod, who is making everybody's life terrible by amassing wealth, the technology of the city, the resources, the benefits for himself, making huge palaces for his behalf, making a name for himself while everybody else suffers. And you're in that situation. asking yourself day after day, is it gonna get better? Maybe you're asking yourself that right now. Is it gonna get better? And the next day comes up and you're asking, it hasn't gotten better. Maybe tomorrow it'll get better. And week after week after week and year after year after year, maybe decades go by. You're no longer 20, you're 30. You're no longer 30, you're 40. You're no longer 40, you're 50, and so on and so forth. And you find yourself not just asking, is it going to get better, but you start to hit a wall saying, it's never going to get better. I'm always going to be stuck in this situation. And then the biggest ensemble of wealthy, powerful, well-connected people roll into your town. Now, I say biggest ensemble because it's not like the song, which wrongly states, we three kings of Orient are. First of all, they weren't kings, they were more like astrologers. Second, there weren't three of them. Most historians think that these guys came from Arabia, which is a long distance from Israel. And if you're wealthy and influential and powerful and you're traveling from Arabia down to the tumultuous terrain near Palestine or ancient Israel, you don't travel in groups of 3. You travel in groups of 53. In fact, most people think that this was probably an entourage of 50 people, all powerful, all influential, carrying a lot of wealth. That would have stirred things up in the best possible way. I just imagine if that happened. Like, I just want you to see this in your mind. Imagine we're having church and like some big, like Kanye West rolls up into church one day for no reason than just to see like what's happening with his entourage. Like that would stir things up. Like, I just want to see what's going on. Like, this is exactly what's happening in the first century. You're a Judean peasant. You're sitting there minding your own business. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You hope that you have your livelihood, your career, your family, your health, and your freedom. And anything could change at a second. And you're living under the weight of that anxiety. And all of a sudden, a huge entourage of powerful, wealthy people roll up. And they're not rolling up for their own agenda. They're rolling up to say, we heard something is happening here. We heard of a more important person that has been born here. And they call him a king. Against the authority of the Roman emperor and the King Herod, there is a different and better king, and he's your king. He's the King of the Jews. That would have stirred things up. Can you imagine the hope that would have welled up in the hearts of your average person as they heard that for the first time? That a king is born in the midst of these tumultuous times. The takeaway at this point is that he's not just born and present in the midst of tumultuous times thousands of years ago, but God is always on the other side of your struggle. Just as those Jewish peasants would have been struggling, and yet like a light shining into their darkness, revealing, don't worry about it. Don't worry about Herod. Don't worry about Rome. Don't worry about what you're going through. A king is being born in the midst of your mess. So the gospel has been proclaiming for thousands of years. God is always on the other side of your struggle. Many of you are struggling in this room. Most of us have struggles. In fact, if you don't have struggles, it's probably because you're only 12. Most of us in here have struggled and are struggling. But the good news of the gospel, the good news of Advent, is that God is always on the other side of your struggle. Even if you don't see him, if all you see is struggle, he's on the other side. And so you might be asking, what do you do about it? Because if God is always on the other side of the struggle, that usually means that he is allowing the struggle to happen in the moment, because sometimes God seems to have to shake things up. Awakenings always seem to come after a shakeup. Dry seasons, desert experiences, wilderness experiences, difficulties, mass tumultuous times. And if you look at history and if you look at the Bible, it always seems, as we saw in Hebrews a couple weeks ago, that it's usually God working in history to shake things up so that fallow ground, as the prophets would call it, will be ready to receive the work that he's doing. Perhaps we live in tumultuous times today because God wants to shake some things up. And the question most of us need to ask, whether it's things are shaking up around us or things are shaking up inside of us or in our lives, the question all of us need to ask is, how will we respond to the shaking? How will we respond to the times? And what we see in the text are 3 responses. There's actually 4. I'll save the 4th one for later. The 3 are bad. 3 responses. The first is we see authorities feeling threatened. In this case, it's Herod. Look at verse 3. When Herod the king heard this, what did he hear? There's a shaking going on. There's a new king that's being born right in your backyard. Herod feels threatened. It says, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Herod the king was troubled. The word for troubled there speaks of roiling water, like if you were to drop a pebble in a body of still water, and it doesn't just impact that little dot right there, but it sends ripples. Pretty soon, within a matter of minutes, everything is stirred up. That's the picture here that the author wants us to have. That Herod has this inner commotion inside him. He no longer has this calmness of mind, and it's spreading. Ever feel that way? Ever feel like roiling water? Something happens over here and it just affects everything in your life, your relationships, your career, your sleeping patterns. And we see that bubbling out from him to the rest of society. This is the second response. Society itself is anxious. Verse 4 tells us when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. The whole city is up in arms. There's a nervous tension in the entire city. Why is that? Because anxiety is viral. Anxiety is contagious and it catches fire very quickly. Edwin Friedman, an ordained rabbi and a practicing family therapist, once wrote that there are 5 characteristics of chronically anxious societies. The first one is reactivity, or what he would say is the vicious cycle of intense reactions between people. The second is herding, the desire for togetherness that forces everyone in the group to adapt to the least mature members in the group. Herding. Blame displacement is the third one, where you're pointing the finger at everyone else instead of taking personal responsibility for your own part to play. Fourth, a quick fix mentality. A low threshold for discomfort that constantly seeks relief of the symptoms rather than deep fundamental change. And the last one, lack of well-differentiated leaders. What he calls a failure of nerve that stems from and contributes to the above 4. This is exactly a picture of what we see in Jerusalem. This is what we see in Jerusalem, a chronically anxious society that doesn't know how to handle pain. Do any of these sound like our current climate? Do any of these sound like our family? This sounds like a lot of our own experience. This sounds like sometimes our churches. This dude wrote this in 1999. This sounds like my life sometimes. Sometimes anxiety bubbles out, catches fire, is extremely contagious. Anxiety is viral. Sometimes authorities feel threatened. Sometimes society itself is anxious. And here's the third one. Sometimes the very people that God has charged to be a light in a dark place, the religious, can compromise. Look at verse 4 through 5. And assembling all the chief priests and scribe of the people. Who assembled them? Herod. Herod assembled all the chief priests and scribes of the people and inquired of them where the Christ was supposed to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for it's there written by the prophets that he would be born in Bethlehem. That might actually look really cool. Like, oh, cool, the religious leaders are, talking to the political leaders and they're reading the Bible together. That's awesome. Until you understand that Rome was sovereign. And they gave Jerusalem some level of autonomy, you understand. Rome is in control of the entire known world. They are the empire, or the dark side. But Jerusalem still has some level of autonomy to govern their own people. And so there's a little group of power brokers. There's still a temple facilities management team, the high priest and the scribes. They can still enact trials for the Jewish people, and they, in a general sense, have some amount of control over Jerusalem. And here's where that gets difficult. Once you have a little bit of power, you don't want to lose it. Once you taste a little bit of power, you don't want to lose it. And it may seem like the chief priests and scribes are doing something good. Like we read this and they're sharing prophecy about the Messiah with Herod. But if you read between the lines and you go through the Gospels, you see that they themselves never actually repent. They know true things about Jesus, but it has not changed their lives. They have a lot of information, but they don't have a lot of transformation. And if you don't have Jesus sitting at the throne of your heart, you have other things sitting there instead. And adding to that, how much the Sadducees, that was the religious body that practiced control over Jerusalem under the imperial control of Rome. The Sadducees loved their autonomy and were often afraid of Rome taking it away. And once you see all of those pieces, you get a vivid picture of religious professionals who know a lot about God but do not know God himself. In fact, in John chapter 11, verse 48, when Jesus is becoming popular because he's saying incredible things, he's healing the sick, he's preaching the gospel, and he's causing a stir. He's causing trouble. The high priest and his entourage say in John chapter 11, verse 48 of Jesus, if we let Jesus go on like this, everyone will believe in him. But the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. You hear that? If we let Jesus do his thing, everybody's going to believe in him. That's a problem for us because we're going to lose our power. Sometimes the religious can compromise. Not just religious professionals and leaders, but religious and spiritual people. And in this situation, the Sadducees are in bed with political power. They've created a civic religion to sustain their positions of influence, much like what happens today. Christianity in America has been co-opted by political powers that often look nothing like Jesus on both sides and in every nook and cranny. Now, it's one thing to be political. A follower of Jesus should have their politics. I say that because Jesus had his politics. If you want to know about Jesus' politics, read Matthew chapter 5, Matthew chapter 6, and Matthew chapter 7. The politics of Jesus. It's one thing to have your politics. It's another when politics has you. When politics owns you. Here's a few litmus tests to see whether you are owned by your politics more than you're owned by Jesus. On one side, you know this is happening when you are unable to critique your own party, your own political affiliations, your own tribe, and your own clique with the way of Jesus. You're critiquing everybody else, but you don't have the heart to critique yourself. If that happens, politics might own you. When you're discipled more by Fox News or by MSNBC, more by the right and more by the left than you are by Jesus, politics might own you. When you know more about who to vote for in the coming elections than you do the Sermon on the Mount or the Gospels, politics might own you. Now, some of you have gone to the other side of that spectrum, complete indifference. You've seen the climate, you're disgusted by it, and you pulled out of the process, and you are indifferent. In other words, you've removed yourself from the world and turned your religion into a private affair. This is just for me. I have the most powerful, most treasured good news that the world has ever heard, keeping it for myself. And you've effectively cut off your effectiveness for the kingdom of God in the world where it matters the most. So there's these two opposite ends of the spectrum. You might be asking, how do you keep this from happening in tumultuous times when you're growing desperate for something that works? And the way followers of Jesus have been called to respond to stuff like this has never changed. It's always been to respond to the times by recalibrating ourselves back to the way of Jesus. By causing our indifference to bow at the authority of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. By causing our other allegiances, whether it's political or relational or communal, to bow to the way of Jesus, to filter everything on this side and that side through the lens of a greater master. A king has been born in the middle of your mess. And he's a better king. He's a better king than you. He's a better king than the kings that are coming. He's a better king than the kings that have been. And he's a king that is in the midst of your mess, and he demands, and he asks for, and he acclaims your allegiance. And so the way of the follower of Jesus is to recalibrate everything that we do through the way of Jesus. And you can't do that unless you know who he is. So I would start reading the Gospels tomorrow. Saturating your mind with the way of Jesus. And as we do that, learning to become a calm, well-defined presence in the midst of an anxious culture. That's exactly what the Magi did. And this is the fourth response. They turned towards Jesus. I think it's ironic that out of religious professionals like the high priest, the Jewish king of Jerusalem, and the Jewish people and the Roman powers, that it was people all the way far removed. It was a bunch of wealthy astrologers from Saudi Arabia that got it. God can use anybody. Maybe he's going to use you. But they drop everything and they recalibrate. This is my third point. How do we respond? I don't know what point it is. It's somewhere in there. It's my next point. How do we respond to tumultuous times, to shaking, to the change? The Magi turned towards Jesus, and that's what we're called to do too. They didn't have degrees in theology. They weren't a part of the temple system. They didn't grow up with a rabbi helping them. They were from Saudi Arabia. They were astrologers. We look down on astrology, and yet God uses them to open the eyes of many people in Jerusalem to the truth and to the gospel. And what do? They drop everything and recalibrate. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, again, verse 1 through 2, the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we've come to worship him. Again, in verse 10 and 11, when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. I'm just trying to imagine these dudes in these cashmere robes or whatever, that they jumping with exceeding great joy, oh, we found it, yeah. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. And it doesn't stop with exceeding joy. It doesn't stop with the indignity of laughing. They fell down and they worshiped him. The most powerful people in the room found somebody more powerful, and they respond in kind. They don't just do it with lip service. They don't just do it with rejoicing. They don't just do it with their knees. They open up their treasures and offer him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Sometimes that's exactly what we need to do in times that are difficult. With whatever you're going through in your family, in your life, in your career, with your loved ones, with grief and loss, sometimes there needs to be those moments of pause where we drop everything for a moment and sit at the feet of Jesus. And not just once a year for Advent, right? And not just once a week for Sunday morning worship, but regularly, day in and day out, so that it becomes a rhythmic habit in our life, that no matter what happens, there is a king, and I'm going to pause to recalibrate my attention towards him. And look at the effect of this practice on the Magi. They came out of nowhere. No theological degrees, none that records show us of deep knowledge of the Son of God, other than there's a star in the sky. They had to be told all of this, interestingly enough, from the high priest and the Sadducees, who missed it all. Or, from the rumors floating about. And yet, look at the effect of their recalibration and their turning to Jesus. Matthew chapter 2, verse 12, it says, and being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. That's powerful to me. It's powerful to me because Herod is powerful. Herod kills people for messing with him. Killed his wife. Killed his 2 sons. That'd be a difficult situation for you to stand on principle and values, right? To stand on the things that you know intellectually. That'd be very difficult. And who are the Magi? They're outsiders and foreigners. And they have defied this guy in this situation. And yet they are able to stand on what they believe is right. They're able to stand on what they value and know to be true and right, even in the midst of a tumultuous atmosphere that is pressuring them to adapt to the lowest common denominator. In fact, not only are they able to withstand pressure, but they seem to be hearing God more clearly in the process. The story started with them looking at a star, and it ends up with them hearing God in a dream. I think God is moving in the lives of the Magi. So I started by saying this is going to be a story about Herod, but it's really a story about Herod and the Magi. Really, it's a story about you and Jesus. Because if you are here listening to this, knowing that it's true, I know that what I need to do is turn towards Christ, and I am going through a lot of tumultuous stuff. Things are falling apart. I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow. I don't know how I'm going to handle this relationship or this conflict or this difficulty or this loss or this sickness. I don't know how I'm going to afford that or get through this. I don't know how I'm going to deal with what's coming up next week. And I know what the right answer is. Nursery school answer, Jesus. All the right answers are Jesus. Like we might know that easily. But when Monday comes, it's difficult to put it in fifth gear. And perhaps some of you are desperately wanting to trust in Jesus and to turn to Jesus, but you're struggling with doubt. You're saying, but all I see is what's right in front of me. And this is my last point, which I hope addresses what you're saying there. There is often breakthrough hidden in unexpected places. And maybe some of you right now are in an unexpected place. This isn't where you thought you would be in this part of your life. This isn't how you thought things would end up for you. Your last year has been pummeled with disappointment and disillusionment, and that is disillusioning you from trusting in God because you thought it would be better and you thought it would be easier. But often that's not how God works. So God seems to enjoy working through difficult processes. And the good news for you is not that life is going to be easy, it's that breakthrough is often hidden in unexpected places. And the unexpected place in our story is in that prophecy that the Sadducees would pronounce to Herod. I want to read it to you in verse 5 through 6. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, that's where this kid's going to be born. For so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall be a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. Interestingly, they are quoting here the prophet Micah. And I actually want to read you the prophet Micah. This is Micah chapter 5, verse 2. If you want to turn there very quickly, you can. I'll just read it to you. It's not on the screen. But they kind of paraphrase the text. I want to read you the original text. It says in verse 2, but you, O Bethlehem, Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah. You don't even fit into your own family. You don't even fit into your own tribe, Bethlehem. You just don't fit in. You're too small. You're too slow. You're too stupid. You don't have enough social collateral. You don't have a wide enough ladder to climb. You're isolated. You don't have enough things going for you. You've struggled too much. You've made too many mistakes. You don't fit in. Bethlehem, you who were too little to be among your own clans, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler over all of Israel. Even though you are all of those things that the world labels you with, I have chosen you to be the place from whom the Messiah is going to arise. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from unexpected places. It doesn't come from Jerusalem. It doesn't always come from Rome. It doesn't come from Athens. Or we could say our biggest and deepest hope doesn't come from Washington, D.C. It doesn't come from MIT. It doesn't come from religious TV. It comes from unexpected places. It comes from places that we're not even looking. In this situation, right there in a podunk town that barely deserved its own place on the map, the King of Kings is born. And right there in the middle of your situation, the King is emerging. In the middle of your suffering, the King emerges. In the middle of your life that's spiraling out of control, even though it feels like nobody sees you and nobody cares, the truth of the gospel, the King emerges. And his name is Jesus, Emmanuel, which means God with us. In the middle of unexpected places and tumultuous times, Jesus Christ can be found. And you might not think he's there, but he's right there. And the question we need to ask oftentimes is not, God, where are you? But God, make me aware of what you're doing. I want to summarize what I went through the last few minutes as I ask Andrea and Moses to come up as we sing. And that's this. We live in tumultuous times. That might be on a big level in culture and society. It might just be in your family or in your personal life. Tumultuous times, though, are often precede a movement or an awakening of God, which causes us to ask, how then will we respond in the meantime? You can respond with insecurity like Herod. You could respond with anxiety like society. You could respond with compromise like lukewarm religious people. Or you can turn towards Jesus like the Magi, over and over and over, knowing that in the midst of whatever it is that you're going through, breakthrough often comes in unexpected places. My initial question at the beginning was, how do you maintain hope when times are tumultuous? You going through tumultuous times? How do you maintain hope? The answer from this Christmas text is that you should drop everything and sit at the feet of Jesus. And not just today, but tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that and the week after that and the week after that. But those times often never get off the ground until you start right now. So today, as a church, let's sit at the feet of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and recalibrate our attention and our hope to him in the midst of whatever it is that you're going through, knowing breakthrough is often hidden in unexpected places.